Uh, so we did our white paper on Greece, and we're basically talking about how the Syrian conflict has affected that. And so we broke it down into different sections, and I'm briefly going to go over each section, and then we're all going to talk about a little bit more in depth about that section. Just give like a 1 to 2 minute overview of each one. Um, so the first one is history, and Ty is going to talk about how Greece has traditionally handled refugee crisis in the past, how they've handled them, and then what they're doing today, and how that's different. Um, Jenny is doing political, so that's going to cover not only the political parties in Greece and the differences of how they're handling the situation. She's also going to cover broader EU policy and how Greece's political parties have kind of spilled over to that. The next section, Ty is going to talk about the military, and so that's the military situation in Syria, and he's going to go over the different factions and kind of how they've developed and what they're doing, and then the military situation in Greece. So that's going to also include the tension between Greece and Turkey and some of Greece's dilemmas. My first section is economic, and so I'm talking about Greece's economic history and their struggles that dated back about 10 years ago and how that's affecting the situation. And then Jen is doing social, and so that's how incoming refugees are handling the situation and some of the problems they're going through. Then the next section is infrastructure, and that's what I'm doing, and that's going to be like uh, cover like a lot of the housing, a lot of the situation that the refugees are facing. Um, they have some pretty bad situations there, so we're going to talk about how they get to that point. Information is the next section. Jen's covering that, and so she has an ingoing and outgoing section. The incoming is the information that's incoming. That's talking about like the asylum process and stuff. And then the outgoing information is going to talk about the dissemination of information to refugees and migrants. And the UNHCR trying to implement maps and islands and give general information to refugees and stuff. The next section, Jenny is going to talk about the physical environment. So, how the refugees affected that and the Greek government. Um, there's a lot of waste, pollution stuff, crisis. Um, and so, how's that affecting Greece's physical environment? And the last section is time. And so, Ty is going to talk about the overview of the situation in Syria and give a timeline. Um, you know, Syria initially thought that the conflict wasn't going to be as bad as it was. Syrians thought that they could just sort of ride out the conflict, and then how's that changed over time with like the rise of ISIS, and as the civil war got worse around 6 years ago or so, migration numbers really spiked. And he also is going to talk about the time in Greece. So Greeks were initially welcoming the migrants, but that patience is sort of worn off, and so he's going to elaborate on that a little bit as well. All right, so my first topic is the economic crisis in Greece. And so the economic crisis predates the, um, the country's refugee crisis. The refugee crisis really started to begin around 2011, while the economic crisis started around 2008, 2009. Um, so the financial crisis, the worldwide financial crisis, hit Greece pretty hard. Greece pretty hard, sorry. Um, and and they're really like just starting to recover. Um, but about last year, they finished their last round of bailouts with the IMF, and they're pretty much became self-sufficient. Their GDP has started to improve, and um, European financial stability mechanism and European stability mechanism. This is what they owe their debts to, and so those have all started to decrease, and they've been able to allocate more funds towards refugee programs. So a lot of the EU money or the EU is covering a lot of the Greece is bearing, but Greece is also having to bear a lot of the own costs themselves. Um, okay, so the European Commission said that Greece's economy grew by about 1.9% in 2018, and they're expected to grow by about another 2.3% this year. So it's looking the economy for Greece is looking good, but they're still facing a lot of problems like unemployment and stuff. In January, they had about 18 to 19% unemployment. So it's not perfect, but it's definitely getting a lot better. And on like more of the local level, um, Greece's biggest industry is tourism, and while the tourist industry is starting to just keep growing, but it's let's see, yeah, there's been like a lot of like local businesses um, that have like pretty much just collapsed because of refugees being in certain areas. But overall, the industry continues to grow. Uh, and another issue that Greece is facing right now is corruption. So the EU provided Greece with about $1.6 billion in emergency funding, and a lot of it has not been tracked very well. So they were pretty much giving out contracts to like government officials that had ties with contractors or whatever to give that money out, and that came about 6 or 7 months ago, and so they're investigating that. So the next section that I'm going to talk about is infrastructure. Um, so one thing that's like a pretty common theme with all of our sections is that Greece really wasn't ready for the refugee crisis. So they did not have hardly any infrastructure in place to handle the incoming refugees. So they had to set up camps pretty much. They had tents that couldn't protect from the weather. They still can't protect from the weather. A lot of the situation hadn't improved. A lot of these areas that are hosting refugees are designed to host, 1,000, but they're hosting 10,000 people, and so they're not really ready for it. Refugees have been sleeping outside under the tarps, stuff like that. And so a lot of the refugees have complained about the situation in the camps, living in open sewage pretty much because they don't have adequate infrastructure to supply the refugees, lack of electricity along the camps. And I think that's about it for infrastructure. So.
Okay. So my first section was on information. I focused on two separate areas with the information aspect. The collection of info from people. Well, okay, let me back up. Incoming and outgoing. So the incoming is the collection of information for people for the asylum process, for the application for asylum procedures. And the outgoing is the info to the refugees, which is like maps and other important info that they need to, once they arrive at the reception and, oh my goodness, I'm sorry. Reception and information processing centers or identification centers. So the asylum procedure that they currently have, they do have a legal framework for it, and it's overseen by the Greek government, but it's kind of lax in its implementation, especially on the mainland. So on the mainland, there is a structural and endemic problem in Greece. With people coming in, people are spending about 40 some days in detention and or reception, depending on whether or not they immediately qualify for, or not immediately, initially qualify for asylum once they submit the applications. Now they are trying to improve it. They do have a newer application process, which is kind of a pre-application. So if they have access to a computer or a phone, the refugees and incoming migrants can apply via Skype, which helps the process along quite a bit. The problem is, though, the Dublin regulation, which states that the first point of entry is basically the place that has to process the asylum applications, and the failed EU-Turkey deal are both contributing to an increased amount of people coming into Greece. And as Drew said, the country was barely ready to take on that many people anyhow, and since Turkey is no longer keeping the overflow and Greece kind of sits at the perfect entrance, whether you're going by sea or land, into the EU, they get a majority of the people before anybody else. And the Dublin regulation makes it so they have to stay in Greece until their applications have gone through the system. The second part, I'm sorry, I need to back up. Outgoing, information going to the refugees, that's maps of the islands, important information depending on the audience that it's going to. And then the other portion is the social. And for the social/humanitarian, I covered, again, geographic location of Greece causes it to be highly traversed. Lack of funding and proper government oversight are causing issues in the RICs. They are deemed unsafe and, as Drew said, unsanitary. Women and children are being exposed to sexual and gender-based violence by locals and other refugees, and a lot of refugees are facing or experiencing onset of PTSD, many from the journey to Greece and the other places they have gone into, especially because a lot of them do come by sea into Greece. And a lot of them are experiencing it after they get into the camps because of the unsafe and unsanitary conditions and being exposed to violence. There is a higher rate of suicide in the camps, and the number of unaccompanied children, minor children, is significant, and that it all kind of compounds together, and all these issues exacerbate each other. So yeah, that's pretty much the overview of my two portions.
All right, so my first portion is physical environment. Originally, I was going to discuss the physical environment facing refugees in their countries of origin, as well as their journey to Europe and how this has affected Greece as a main entry point. However, once I started researching, I found that Greece's physical environment has experienced serious degradation due to the refugee crisis. This is something I had been relatively unaware of and felt it was deserving of attention, as the long-term effects could be devastating if corrective action isn't taken. So first, life preservers and dinghies used by refugees making the journey are used only once usually and then discarded on shore, damaging the fragile ecosystem of the Aegean Sea. And the other issue is that refugee camps have created an additional daily waste of 10 to 30 tons of municipal solid waste. So both of these have affected Greece differently. Many of the islands that are home to refugee camps don't have their own waste facilities, requiring enhanced measures to remove the MSW. The cost to remove this additional waste ranges anywhere from 1,500 to 5,500 euros a day. On top of this, not all of the additional waste is properly disposed of, adding to the litter in the natural environment. Additionally, the damage being done to the Aegean Sea and the natural beauty of Greece is affecting tourism, which contributes to nearly 20% of the country's GDP. If action isn't taken to get this damage under control, it could have long-term, potentially irreversible effects on the sea's ecosystem. So this is not only devastating from an environmentalist perspective, but from an economic perspective as well. Obviously, Drew, you mentioned the economic crisis and how Greece is kind of just like getting out of it. So it kind of needs every ounce of income it can get. The US government could assist Greece by adopting policy that supports local government, the UN, and NGO action to employ refugees to help rectify the situation. Refugees could assist with MSW collection and disposal, which could help to reduce the cost and ensure waste is disposed of properly within camps. The US government could also assist programs like the Safe Passage Bag Project, which helps refugees collect life preservers, dinghies, and other discarded items and turn them into reusable bags to sell. This has actually provided refugees with an income and helped clean up the physical environment. Creating more opportunities like this would continue to empower refugees and better the condition of Greece's natural areas. Lastly, a huge way the US could help is with educational programs to teach locals and refugees the importance of maintaining the areas of physical environment. And then political. So Greece's political environment has been under tension for the past few years. As the current government works to recover from the economic crisis and sort out the refugee crisis, shifts have happened both within country as well as more broadly in the European Union. Internally, Greece's Syriza party will be facing the New Democratic Party, which is gaining momentum. Polls have shown that roughly 1/3 of the country is in favor of this new party, which takes a harder line on refugees. If the New Democratic Party were to gain control, refugees could face denial of entry as well as large expulsions of those already in country. Externally, the New Democratic Party is also taking up more of Greece's seats in the European Parliament. As mentioned, this could contribute to a harder stance in general for refugees looking to seek asylum in the EU. Additionally, the European Union's deal with Turkey from 2016, aptly named the EU-Turkey deal, has created a crisis in itself within Greece. The goal of this deal was to alleviate stress on EU countries by sending some more of the refugees and economic migrants back to Turkey. And while most EU countries have seen a decrease in asylum seekers, Greece has not. Instead, movement restrictions resulted in over 12,000 refugees becoming trapped. And until movement is allowed, the living conditions in these refugee camps are only going to continue to degrade. As a response, the US government could take forms of action by supporting the Syriza government, and then also to supporting policy that kind of allows for better movement of refugees once they arrive in Greece and in the EU in general. And that concludes my sections. Off to you, Ty.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Just to start out, just with a little bit of history, we have to be clear with ourselves that the relationship between Syrians and Greeks is no new one. We've seen a long history of migration out of Syria and into Greece, dating back particularly to the fight you had between Arabs and Byzantines and the ancient Greeks. At minimum, back to the 10th century. What we see now in terms of migration is nothing new. What we have to do is use history as a guide for us to determine what has happened in the past, what ways this migration has affected the world as a whole, and we have to use that as a guide to what we can do as far as policies going forward, and just having solid policies in all realms of our analysis. So moving forward into time, the policy outcome that we have for time is broken down to the statement: an increasing perception in Greece that the Syrian migration is taking place at the wrong time due to domestic volatility in politics and its economy has joined in conjunction with a sense in Syria that time has run out. So basically, it's the wrong time in Greece. It's the wrong place and the wrong time for the migration. And in Syria, time has absolutely run out, and migration is a last resort for the residents of Syria. So U.S. policy now holds leverage to insert its military forces into the Mediterranean state of Greece in order to not only assist the country's border enforcement operations, but to have greater oversight and evolution and solutions to the conflict in Syria. Moving forward into the introduction into time, Syria's mass migration into the European Union, and specifically into Greece during the years of 2011 through the present, has been spurred by the idea of deflating time. Said simply, time's running out. Both Syrian government and civil populations, as well as the government and civilian population of EU member state Greece, who shares a substantial burden of the migration, has to be wary of the idea of time, space and time in relation to desired policy outcomes with the migration. Said simply, again, time affects everything, influences all decisions. In relation to the migrant crisis we're currently witnessing across the Middle East and Europe, various perspectives of time must be considered for the U.S. to develop and act upon a desirable policy outcome to stem the crisis. An understanding of time perspective from the migrants of Syria and the residents of Greece continues to be a challenge with us going forward. So moving forward, 2011 to 2013, the Syrian population believed that they had time. The year 2011 saw the beginnings of the Syrian civil war, in which President Assad unquestionably crushed all dissent within his country and was seeking to hold on to power. Perception early in the civil war, while this was still an internal conflict, was roughly between 2011 and 2013 that the Syrian population could hold out hope, that residents did not have to migrate or seek refuge because the conflict would solve itself. There was no need to depart, and in their minds, time was on their side. Of the 5 million Syrian refugees and migrants that we see at present, early 2013 was shown to be the turning point where which only 500,000, up to 2013, 500,000 Syrians had yet to seek refuge or migrate. So that moves us into the 2013 to present aspect of time. Rapid developments on the peninsula, the Arab Peninsula, shifted the perception of time in Syria and ultimately in Greece. Islamic State saw a large rise in that late 2013, early 2014 period, ultimately declaring their caliphate, and in early 2014 declaring their capital actually in Raqqa, northern Syria. So obviously you see that civil war had kind of broken up the country. It allowed for the Islamic State to make their move into Syria. So time was running out for the individuals who earlier felt that time was on their side. So within Greece, the aspect of time, it's one of the wrong place at the wrong time. The idea that the Syrian migration expanded as Greece dove directly into their financial crisis, it's obviously synonymous with this idea. Greece across the Mediterranean simply exclaimed that the migration was taking place the wrong place, wrong time. Early 2012 saw 51% of Syrian migrants making their way to Greece. So obviously more than half of the migrants were moving into Greece in 2012. This was just about 3 years after we saw the initial ramifications of Greece's economic crisis. They made their way over land and over water across the Mediterranean. And this was the year in which interest rates spiked and reached their ceiling. 30% interest rates is what we were seeing about this time in Greece. While Greeks were initially welcoming, as increased flows of migrants flooded the country, they actually put up barbed wire fences around the borders, and the border was closed under Operation Aspida as the government and its citizens dug in for the long haul. Greece had realized that the time was not right. Solutions would have to be found within the country of origin and within the neighboring countries within Syria. That closes out time. I'll now move into the military aspect of the analysis. So up front, the policy outcome for the military. The United States reinforces the Greek military, allows for increased overland and overwater security for the increased number of migrants that become stuck in Turkey. This would ideally bankrupt and cause friction in Turkey compelling Turkey to pressure President Assad out of office and ending the crisis. U.S. forces would provide reinforcement to Kurdish factions. So this will be, so the Turkey aspect would be in the west, putting pressure on Turkey from the west, the Kurdish faction from the east. So U.S. forces provide reinforcement to Kurdish factions fighting in northeast Syria, with the end state of bringing about a dilemma that compels Turkish leaders to choose between fighting Kurdish YPG members or dealing with the turbulence that we would obviously see within Turkey in their economy and politics with an increased inflow of migrants from Syria. Introduction: overwhelmed by an increased inflow of migrants originating in Syria, increasing by orders of magnitude in the last 8 years, the abilities of the Greek military, police, and Coast Guard to handle the crisis had been pushed out of its internal control. Syria's armed forces had played a large role in the outflow of migrants. Assad's army had initiated a conflict which had forced many people from their homes, while we saw the rise of various factions, including the Kurdish YPG, the Islamic State, and rebel Free Syrian Army personnel. Russia and the U.S. obviously major powers that are still trying to inflict policy into the region. Within Syria, the military situation: competing military and militant factions within Syria see Syrian government forces controlling a vast majority of the country, south and central of Aleppo and Raqqa, so central Syria. Kurdish forces retaining the northeastern portion of Syria. Kurdish forces present a grave danger to both the government of Syria and Turkey. Continued Western advance by the Kurds places the ability of Turkey to combat the Kurds while also halting the illegal movement of migrants into question. It's either one or the other. Fight Kurds or halt this movement that may destabilize our Turkey and their country. Emphasis by the United States has to be placed on reinforcing the Kurds from the east and placing Turkey into a dilemma. Within Greece, the military situation: a debt crisis has not had a substantial effect on the growth of the Greek armed forces, which is actually a dumbfounding fact, but it has not, due to Greece's overwhelming persistence to maintain their military at a state of readiness where they could on call engage in conflict with Turkey. This conflict between Greece and Turkey is important to note. Going back to some of the prior notes of the EU and the deal between Greece and Turkey. Unchallenged, Greece can turn away massive amounts of migrants, forcing them back into Turkey, and subsequently providing for a proportional amount to be settled in the EU's interior. Obviously, the EU is not willing to allow that to happen. So basically what we see is either migrants into Greece or into Turkey, depending on that fight there. So just to close, in achieving the overall goal of stemming migration from Syria into Greece, the Greek forces must first gain the capability to halt immigration, overland and over water, and secondly, to be capable of implementing their policy into the conversation with Syria, compelling Turkey to pressure the resignation of President Assad. Last thing, just to close the links up a bit between time and military, what we see is time is up in Syria first. That is forcing migration through Turkey into Greece. The idea of time in Greece is that this migration is happening at the wrong place and the wrong time. This is where U.S. policy would step in, which would be to reinforce Greece militarily and allow for substantial buildup of border security by the Greek forces. And this would force migrants to remain in Turkey. So this is where we see the dilemma placed on Turkey. This would ideally damage Turkey's economy if we see a large inflow of migrants who have to remain in Turkey. and Turkey will be compelled to pressure structural changes in Syria. And ideally, we will see the lessening of conflict in Syria just because of the power that Turkey has over Syria. External pressure, obviously, from the east with the Kurds will create a multiple dilemma for Turkey. So that closes up the a brief history of migration from Syria into Greece, the military aspect and the time aspect. And that also closes up our presentation as a whole. So thank you all for watching.